This happened to my friend Jane sometime when she was in her mid-20s in 2015. She used to live in the countryside at the time of this story, so oftentimes she would have to drive herself into the city. Normally, it would take about 20 to minutes to a half an hour to drive there and back, but Jane didn't really mind the drive as she came from a family with money, so this was honestly a pretty good advantage of it. Jane was driving home from the city one night as she had a really busy night. She was living with a few of her friends at the time as unfortunately her parents and her got into a verbal altercation that resulted in Jane moving out. However, though, this was sometime during the fall of 2015, so the weather was pretty cool. However, when Jane was driving back from the city, she often takes the back roads to get there as she didn't really care for the highway so much. However, she's always gone to the back road every time and never had once encountered anything creepy. However, after this story though, she does have second thoughts on taking the road in the night. She tries not to drive there too much at night now, but this was one of the stories that really confused her. Jane was driving down when she looked up ahead to see a street light, and then there was this man who seemed to be standing there. Jane pulled over and looked. With the headlights pointing at the figure, she wasn't sure as to why he was standing there or what he was doing. He seemed to be staring out of the blue. He didn't seem to acknowledge that Jane was there or anything, so this honestly got really creepy. Jane got out of her van and proceeded to take out her hunting knife and put it in her pocket, just in case if anything were to get anything suspicious or if this figure was going to attack her. She ended up asking who it was or if he needed help. He honestly didn't acknowledge that she was speaking. This was honestly very weird, as he was just staring at Jane. Jane asked again if he needed help, to which he didn't say anything still. Once Jane walked closer slowly, she began talking to the figure, asking if he was okay, if he needed help, and etc. But as she got about 6 feet away from the figure, he suddenly turns off and runs off in the other direction. The funny thing is that there was no vehicle or something, unless he just walked up there. Maybe he was hitchhiking? She honestly had no idea how he appeared or why he disappeared off into the night. However, she decided to think maybe her friends were pranking her, so she ended up going back to her car and vehicle and drove back to her house. When she got back there, she asked her friends if they were playing any pranks. She ended up explaining that she saw the hooded figure in the distance who took off, didn't even acknowledge that she was there. One of her friends said, "Oh, that wasn't any of us." "What do you mean? Did he own a car?" Jane had proceeded to explain everything, and what her friends said was something that she never expected. There was a tale about this guy who somehow murdered his boyfriend and he somehow took his own life. This honestly got Jane convinced that what she experienced that day or night was completely paranormal. I used to know a teacher who used to work at a hotels back sometime in the early 90s. He was around his 20s to early 30s at the time. We'll call him by the name Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams was a science teacher, but he used to work at a hotel clerk and as basically a security guard at the time. Now, I can't exactly when sometime in the 90s this happened, like the year wise, but let's just say it was sometime around the 1990s. Mr. Williams used to be a security guard and would be occasionally a store clerk every now and then for some things, but Most of the time he was just checking and working at the hotel, mainly making sure that everyone checked in and out, and if there was any trouble in any of the rooms, he'd be there. However, he was working on the 5th floor of the hotel. He was basically walking around back and forth, and as he was walking back and forth doing his duty, it was sometime late at night when all of a sudden he heard some really weird scratching noises. He honestly thought that maybe it could have been maybe one of the hotel guest rooms, and it was way past curfew, so he was going to go and let them know that they need to remain quiet. But as he turned out, it came from one of the hotel room doors. He knocked on the door and said to them politely to quiet down. However, there was no sound on the other end, and it was a room. However, he didn't want to have to break the room or go down to the reception office and let them know. He knocked again, but there was no answer, so he thought they must have been done. He turned around and continued to do his own thing, when all of a sudden he heard the scratching again, and this time he banged on the door, but thankfully it stopped. He honestly had no idea what was making the scratching noises, if there was someone in there. He ended up going down to the reception office and said to the lady, there was this bed, there was the hotel room that was making scratching noises. Eventually she had a worried and shocked expression. Oh, that hotel room was closed off. It's supposed to be renovated. As soon as Mr. Williams heard that, he had never once worked a night shift again, and he still has no idea if something was making the scratching noises or who was. But unfortunately, the paranormal seems to be a mystery. Now, this was about some time ago, probably maybe last week or something. I honestly don't know what to expect, so I'm going to keep this as short as I possibly can. Now, this was some time ago, maybe sometime at night, when I was putting some clothes in the laundry. As I was putting some dirty clothes in the washer and I put some in the dryer, I all of a sudden heard what seemed to be my mom calling me. I honestly turned, but I couldn't see where she was, but she was in bed. I thought she was in bed, so I thought maybe she was calling me from upstairs. I told her to give me a sec and I would go up. After that, I put all my clothes, I took the clothes that were from the dryer who were clean and threw the ones in the washer to be cleaned. However, when I picked up the basket, I heard some really weird demonic voices. I honestly couldn't tell where it came from or who was there, but I know for sure I was in the basement by myself. When I went upstairs, and I ended up not going back in the basement for the rest of the night. So since this was recently, I believe this might have been a few days ago. I don't really know for a fact, but it was a few days ago. When I got upstairs, I put the laundry down and found my mom on the bed looking on her phone. I told her I heard her calling my name from the basement and then heard some weird noises. My mom said she wasn't calling me, so she went downstairs but found nothing in the basement. I still don't know to this day if it was paranormal or not, but it has been happening to me for, I guess, a while now. I don't really know if it was paranormal or not, but this was honestly an experience that I have no idea what the unknown will bring. For some context, this happened to one of my friends who used to be a pretty cool high school friend until he left for college. At the time of this story, we'll call him by his name, Jack. Jack was about in his late teens, early 20s at the time, and this was before he moved out to college. He and I got along just fine, but of course, Jack was mainly the busy kind, mainly with work and stuff, but he did have a girlfriend who he started dating since and senior year. Was name was was Mallory. Mallory and Jack got along just fine, and they had no issues with each other. However, Jack was living with his mom at the time, as his dad, unfortunately, was verbally and physically abusive towards him and his mother. His mother was a single mom for about 4 years at the time, and Jack was moving on to a happier life. He hadn't seen his dad since, so he has no idea where his dad is, as that's why he's not in the picture. Now, Mallory along with Jack were basically watching a movie, and all of a sudden they decided to go down to the basement as Jack needed to check on something. For whatever reason, the TV was not working, and it cut off randomly. This was during the time when they had a really bad Wi-Fi connection and that, so Jack ended up going downstairs and to see what was going on with the breakers. None of the breakers were off, so maybe it might have been a storm that cut off the TV signal. However, he was in the basement when he all of a sudden heard what seemed like something dropped on the ground. That honestly spooked him, and he turned on the lights of the basement and couldn't see anything. But he did see what seemed to be one of the books that fell off the shelf. He picked up the book and placed it back, but he looked around but couldn't see anyone. He thought Mallory might be just playing a trick, but there was no reason why Mallory would be down here. She said to Jack if she found out what was going on. Jack came back upstairs when he all of a sudden heard what seemed to be a loud shriek from behind him. He ran upstairs and closed the basement door, and Mallory was honestly confused as to why Jack was freaking out. She ended up calming him down though, and Jack ended up saying that he heard something like a loud shriek downstairs. Mallory ended up getting his mom, which his mom came home at least an hour later, but when she looked, she couldn't see anybody in the basement, and she said that she had been hearing about those shrieks too when she came up and down from the basement. They moved out of that house at least a few months later, as it couldn't handle the paranormal feelings, but this was one that stood out for Jack the most. My friend who knew someone, which happened to be one of her closest friends or ex-friend now that she had a falling out with this one person. Her name at the time was Xenia. Xenia. Xenia was 17 at the time of the story, and she was home alone while her parents were both at work. Now, normally most of the time she would either FaceTime call with her friends or whatever, but however, this story really stuck out for her the most. Xenia was just basically doing her own thing, watching TV, when all of a sudden she gets a really weird phone call. She looked up at the phone but didn't recognize any of the number. She picked it up and put it into her ear and said, "Hello? Who's this?" Whatever it was let out a really messed up demonic shriek. Xenia ended up hanging up the phone but had no idea as to who it was. She ended up picking up the same call again from her phone when it came through, and more demonic shrieks and screams, but there was actually no voices on the other end. Xenia ended up turning off her phone for the rest of the night and never ever brought this up to her parents, thinking that they would not believe her. I think that call was either someone pranking on her or it was something paranormal. That's a question that she will not unfortunately have an answer to.